Core Measure 8, record vital signs. The objective of Core Measure 8 is to ensure that doctors are recording and maintaining changes within a patient's vital signs, specifically the elements of their height, weight, blood pressure, as well as body mass index. Now notice here in the objective they got a 5th point to plot and display growth charts as well for children between the ages of 2 and 20. The requirements of the measure are that more than 50% of all unique patients age 2 and over who are seen during the reporting period have these specific vital signs recorded in their structured data. The requirements for the attestation: denominator is looking at the number of unique patients age 2 or over who are seen during the reporting period. So similar to our other measures where it's looking at each patient seen only once, regardless of how many visits, this is zeroing in on all of those patients regardless of number of visits, however, specifically only age 2 and over. So children under the age of 2 are not subject to having vital signs recorded. With regards to the numerator, the number of patients out of the denominator who actually have these data elements recorded in the structured data. Now specifically here, CMS has defined that the height, the weight, and the blood pressure must be data entered by you. Whether it's the provider, the nurse, the MA, they must be explicitly keyed into the EHR by the staff. And then the body mass index must be calculated by us, the EHR vendor. Now, even though the objective mentions the growth chart, it is not a requirement of attestation, so there's no provision, even at CMS, when you are reporting the numerator to indicate a growth chart. However, since it is part of the definition, you need to know that within Prognosis, you do have the ability of generating a chart so that if you were to ever be audited, you would know how to demonstrate that. With regards to exclusion, there are actually a couple of ways to be excluded from Core Measure 8. Firstly, if you treat nobody 2 and over. That is probably a rare circumstance of a private office physician, but if you happen to be one who only treats newborn up to 2 years old, you could exclude yourself. Or a more broadly applicable exclusion is that any eligible provider who feels within your own medical discretion that these specific vital signs of height, weight, and blood pressure really have no relevance or significance in the scope of your practice, then you also can exclude yourself here. For example, many specialties such as podiatry or chiropractic or ophthalmology, who doesn't really need height and weight and BMI within the scope of their care, you are actually able to exclude yourself here. Now, family practice or pediatricians where these things are relevant, not so much. But it is at the physician's discretion. And then during the attestation process, you will have to declare specifically which exclusion you have taken on your part. Now we're going to toggle into Prognosis and take a look at this specific process of capturing vitals. Now, for those of you who do the data entry of vital signs on the clinical side, you're familiar with this vital signs template. And notice that off the bat, nothing is selected because obviously on every visit, vital signs are going to be specific to that day's visit. The way Prognosis's user interface works with these templates is when you enter a value in the result field, the system will automatically select the checkbox. So for instance, right now we're looking at our weight field. And if I type in the patient's weight of 225, notice when I field exit, the system is going to put a check mark in that checkbox. Same thing with the height. If I go ahead and enter his height, the system puts a check mark. That is because upon entering a value in the result field, the system says, okay, they've entered a value, give them credit. The check mark is what indicates to the system you deserve credit for that. That says put it on your progress note for that day. That says count it into your E&M calculation if applicable. Makes it available for reporting. Now, the BMI is a little different. If you'll recall back in the PowerPoint, the second bullet point in our cloud said that it is the responsibility of the EHR to provide the BMI. Once you have entered the height and weight, That is all that's needed for the calculation for the BMI. Now notice in this case on the template, the BMI field is a beigey yellow color instead of white. And that denotes to you visually that that is a system calculated field. So even though my cursor is there, as I am hitting my keyboard right now, nothing is happening because that system value field is not available for data entry. That said, notice that our BMI checkbox is not selected. If you do not explicitly click that checkbox, the system is not going to calculate that BMI or give you credit for it, nor will you get credit for meaningful use. And it is a fourth element that is required for compliance here. So this is one area where many providers are potentially failing their meaningful use compliance because they're used to the system just calculating the BMI for them. But unless you explicitly click the checkbox, it's not going to give you credit on the meaningful use report. So please remember that even though the others will automatically select when you enter the value, BMI you must explicitly select. And now we're going to go ahead and also enter our blood pressure. And then we're going to save our template. Now right there, I am compliant. For William Hopeful, we have entered height, weight, blood pressure, and the system notice has populated the BMI of 31 because I selected the checkbox. Had I not selected the checkbox for the BMI, notice the system did not calculate it. All four are required for compliance in that 50%. Now, secondly, the other thing to keep in mind with regards to being compliant on your vital signs, because many providers have gotten to the point where they want to do attestation and their vitals measure falls up short and they don't understand why, because they're in the habit of taking vital signs for every patient. The reason goes beyond having just selected the question, but ensuring that the questions you're answering are defined in your system property. So each question on a template, for instance, has a code associated with it, a test ID code. I'm just going to open up the weight question to show you this. And notice in the upper left there is a code. In this example, VT weight, which stands for vitals weight. Height also has a unique code, VT height, for vitals height, and so on. So every one of these four questions needs to be defined in the system configuration in order to give you credit on the meaningful use report. So to show you how to do that, I'm going to go under Settings and Configuration. Now the configuration menu is restricted by your access. By default, all clinical staff do have access to this vital signs property. It is something that Prognosis will define in the background for you when you request to have meaningful use turned on in your practice. However, if you create and customize your own templates, you may need to come in here and modify these properties to accommodate those new codes that you create. So on the right-hand column, Admin, I am going to choose the option called Properties. And you see that I am logged in as Dr. Cooper, so these are the properties that I have access to in my practice. Many of the properties are reserved for Bismatics use or for your system administrator, but these are ones you actually have access to. I have typed in vitals, and I am going to simply select that property now. As you look at this table of vital signs properties, notice the very top one here is my blood pressure question. .bp.test code is the property that the system is looking at when it comes time to generate your meaningful use report. In this example, my question defined is VT07792. Now that was the question that I just answered back on William Hopeful's chart. However, many doctors have their own preferences. Some like a single fractional field, such as in this example, whereas others prefer to have each of the blood pressure numbers registered as independent fields for their own purposes. And if that's the case, maybe you have two separate questions, vital signs systolic, vital signs diastolic. Or maybe you created one called vitals blood pressure. The properties accept a comma delimited list, as you can see here. So if you are a practice who uses multiple templates or multiple questions, just ensure that every question that your staff could potentially answer is defined in the property so that you get proper credit. So not only do you want the properties defined, but also you want to make sure that you have gotten each of the check boxes back on the vitals template selected so that not only does it go to your progress note for that visit, but more importantly, you get credit for meaningful use compliance. Most importantly, remember you must explicitly click the BMI checkbox. So if we go back to a summary here on our vital signs. First of all, as we just discussed, make sure your test codes are defined in those properties. If applicable, you can do a comma-delimited list. You must then explicitly enter the height, weight, and blood pressure for all your patients over the age of 2. Remember to explicitly select the BMI checkbox before saving the template. Remember to save the template so that you get credit for all 4 of those vital signs. And then just as an FYI, even though growth chart is not a requirement of attestation, it is part of the defined objective. So if you were to get audited, for instance, and you needed to demonstrate the growth chart, back in prognosis, if you notice up here underneath our patient menu, we have an option called growth chart. Now, for the patient I have up, it is an adult patient, so the growth chart would not be applicable. But the way the system functions is that if you have entered those vital signs on your template and saved them, notice here when I choose my chart in the drop-down, whichever chart is applicable, for instance, body mass index is a requirement, you can click this option that says show points. And if I had a child, this graph over here would have plotted the points to show how that patient's body mass index has changed over time. So the beauty of the way the growth chart works is it is real time and it pulls the data off of your vital signs template. So even though it's not a requirement of attestation, you do not need to modify your workflow currently if you don't already do growth charts, because you're not required to. But if an auditor came in, you would want to make sure that you know how to do that. And as long as those vital signs have previously been saved on your template, then you could come in here for your auditor and generate the growth chart.